They told you Mongolian food was just boiled meat, but they never told you about the ancestors who developed one of the most sophisticated survival cuisines in human history across the harshest terrain on Earth. They never told you that what was cooked in a felt tent on the Mongolian steppe, with no permanent kitchen, no fixed pantry, nothing but animals and fire, and the accumulated knowledge of a nomadic civilization, fed the largest contiguous empire the world has ever seen. What my Mongolian ancestors cooked was not simple. It was extraordinary, and most of it still exists today, in kitchens and tents and festival grounds, waiting for the world to pay attention. 1. Korkhog, the stone-cooked meat of the steppe. There are no pots in the grassland. There are no ovens. There is no fixed kitchen. So the Mongolian ancestors invented something better than all of them. Korkhog is meat, mutton or goat, cut into large pieces on the bone, cooked together with river stones that have been heated in a fire until they are intensely hot. The meat, stones, vegetables, and a little water are sealed inside a metal container or a sheep's stomach and left to cook in the heat retained by the stones. The sealed environment creates steam. The stones cook the meat from the inside and outside simultaneously. The result, after 45 minutes to an hour, is meat so tender it pulls from the bone without resistance, with a flavor deepened by the minerals in the stones and the steam of its own fat and juices. Korkhog is served as a celebration dish at weddings, at Nadam festival, at important family gatherings on the steppe. It is served communally. The pieces passed around a circle, each person taking what they want. The stones that cooked the meat are passed around separately, held in the hands to warm them, passed from person to person as a gesture of shared warmth. On the cold steppe, a hot stone passed between hands is not a small thing. It is intimacy. It is belonging. The technique predates recorded Mongolian history. Archaeological evidence suggests stone cooking was practiced on the Central Asian steppe for thousands of years before the Mongol Empire. It is one of the oldest cooking methods on Earth, not primitive, but perfectly adapted to a landscape where wood for fuel was scarce, permanent structures were impossible, and the people needed a method that could be executed anywhere with nothing but stones, fire, and an animal. This dish has survived because the conditions that created it still exist. Mongolian herder families on the steppe still live in yurts, the circular felt tents that the rest of the world calls yurts, still move with their animals across the grassland through the seasons, and still cook Korkhog for celebrations the way their ancestors did for 1,000 years before them. The landscape preserved the dish. The dish preserved the culture. It was never just cooked meat. It was a civilization's answer to the question of how to feast in a place where everything was temporary except the fire and the stone. 2. Booz, the steamed dumpling that marks the new year. Every culture has a dumpling. Mongolia's is Booz. And around Tsagan Sar, the Mongolian Lunar New Year, the white month, every family makes them by the hundreds. Booz are steamed dumplings made from a simple wheat flour dough, rolled thin and cut into circles, filled with minced mutton or beef seasoned with onion, garlic, and salt, then crimped closed in a specific folded pattern that allows a small steam vent at the top, steamed in a tiered bamboo or metal steamer for 20 to 25 minutes until the dough is just cooked and the filling is fragrant and juicy. Eaten by hand, dipped in soy sauce or a vinegar chili sauce. One is never enough. The average Mongolian adult eats between 20 and 50 Booz at a single Tsagan Sar sitting. In the weeks before Tsagan Sar, Mongolian families gather to make Booz together. It is assembly line cooking at a family scale. One person rolling, another cutting, another filling, another crimping. A family will make 1,000 Booz or more, freezing them to be steamed over the 2-week celebration period when guests arrive continuously. The number of Booz a family makes is a quiet measure of their hospitality and their resources. The dumpling tradition in Mongolia has clear connections to Chinese dim sum traditions carried along the Silk Road, and to Turkish and Central Asian dumplings called manti that share a common ancestor. But Booz are distinctly Mongolian in their filling, the mutton and the onion and the simplicity, and in their occasion. They are not everyday food. They are New Year food. They are made by family, for family, over several days of shared labor that is itself the celebration. The grandmother in this family has been leading the Booz making for 30 years. She assigns tasks by age and ability. The youngest children learn to pinch the crimps. The teenage grandchildren take over the rolling. She handles the filling seasoning herself, tasting and adjusting without measuring, and the family has learned not to offer suggestions about the salt. It was never just a dumpling. It was a family's New Year, made by hand, one crimp at a time, until there were enough for everyone who might arrive. 3. Airag, the fermented mare's mic that sustained an empire. The Mongol armies that conquered half the known world between 1206 and 1294 did not carry supply lines the way European armies did. They carried their provisions with them, on horseback in the form of the animals themselves, and one of those provisions, one of the most important, was Airag. Airag is fermented mare's milk, the milk of female horses collected during the summer months when the mares are producing, fermented in a large leather sack called a kokur by the natural bacteria, and yeast on the horse's skin and in the sack itself. The fermentation is accelerated by churning. The sack is agitated thousands of times over several days, traditionally by anyone who passes it using a long wooden paddle. The result is a slightly fizzy, mildly alcoholic, between 1 and 3% tart and refreshing drink with a flavor unlike anything in Western dairy tradition. Airag was a complete nutrition source for Mongolian nomads. It contains protein, fat, vitamins B and C, remarkable for a diet with limited access to fruits and vegetables, and the mild alcohol acted as a preservative. A Mongol warrior could subsist on Airag and dried meat for days or weeks on campaign without needing any other food source. The drink was not a luxury, it was a military technology. Marco Polo described Airag in the 13th century as a drink resembling white wine that made him feel very good. William of Rubruck, a Franciscan monk who visited the Mongol court in 1253, described the Airag ceremony in detail: the sack, the churning, the offering to guests as an act of respect. These accounts are the earliest written records of a tradition that nomadic Mongolian families had been practicing for thousands of years before anyone wrote it down. Today, Airag is still made on the Mongolian steppe every summer. Families who keep horses still ferment the milk in leather sacks, still churn it by hand, still offer it to guests as the first drink of welcome. The tradition has survived urbanization, Soviet collectivization, which dramatically disrupted nomadic life in the 20th century, and the transition to a market economy. The horse and the leather sack and the summer milk, and the grandmother who knows when the fermentation is ready, these have outlasted everything. It was never just a fermented drink. It was the fuel of the largest empire in history, made by hand in a leather bag on the back of a horse. 4. Tsuivan, the noodle dish that connects every Mongolian to every other. Ask a Mongolian living abroad what they miss most about their grandmother's cooking. The answer, more often than not, is Tsuivan, not Korkhog, which requires a steppe and river stones, not Airag, which requires a mare, Tsuivan, because Tsuivan can be made anywhere, and when it is made right, it tastes exactly like home. Tsuivan is a stir-fried noodle dish made with hand-pulled noodles, wheat flour and water, kneaded into a stiff dough, rolled flat, steamed, then cut into thick strips, stir-fried with mutton or beef, onion, carrots, and cabbage, seasoned with soy sauce and black pepper. The noodles are chewy and substantial. The meat is tender from a brief initial braise before the frying. The vegetables are soft with slightly caramelized edges. The whole dish is dry. No broth, no sauce, just the fat and seasoning coating every strand. Tsuivan evolved with clear influence from Chinese noodle traditions carried along trade routes through Inner Mongolia and the borders of China. But Mongolian Tsuivan is distinct in its use of mutton, almost always mutton, and in the hand-pulling technique that produces noodles with a thickness and chewiness that machine-made pasta cannot replicate. The noodle pulling is a skill passed from grandmother to grandchild, a physical knowledge that lives in the hands. During the Soviet period from 1924 to 1990, Mongolia underwent forced collectivization and significant cultural suppression. Nomadic herding was reorganized into collective farms. Traditional practices were discouraged. The food culture survived in part because Tsuivan could be made in an apartment kitchen in Ulaanbaatar as easily as in a yurt on the steppe. It required only flour, meat, and vegetables, all of which were available even in difficult times. Its portability, in cultural terms, and its adaptability to different settings is one of the reasons it survived what other dishes did not. It was never just noodles and mutton. It was the dish that kept tasting like home even when home was 1,000 miles away and the world had changed beyond recognition. 5. Aaruul, the dried curd that lasted all winter. On the Mongolian steppe, winter is not a season. It is a test. Temperatures drop to -40. Snow covers the grassland for months. The animals survive on stored fodder. The people survive partly on what they made and stored in summer. And one of the most important things they made was Aaruul. Aaruul is dried curd, made from the Aaruul left after making butter from fermented milk. The curds are strained, shaped into pieces, flat discs, cylinders, small bricks, and dried in the sun and wind of the short Mongolian summer until they are completely desiccated and hard enough to chip a tooth if you are not careful. They are then stored for winter when they provide protein, fat, and calcium through the months when fresh dairy is unavailable. Aaruul tastes like a very dry, very sharp aged cheese, intensely lactic, slightly sour, crumbly when it is eaten fresh and rock hard when fully dried. It is eaten as a snack, dissolved in tea, or given to children to suck on during the day like candy. Mongolian children are raised on Aaruul the way Western children are raised on crackers and cheese. It is the default snack, the school lunchbox staple, the thing you grab from the bag without thinking. The making of Aaruul is considered women's work in the traditional division of Mongolian nomadic labor, and it is one of the most time-sensitive tasks of the summer. The curds must be shaped and dried during the peak of summer heat and wind. If rain comes before they are dry, the batch is lost. The grandmother who manages the Aaruul production watches the sky and the wind and makes decisions about when to put the curds out and when to bring them in that no one else in the family is trusted to make. Aaruul has been made on the Mongolian steppe for over 2,000 years. It is one of the oldest processed foods in Central Asian history. It survived the fall of empires, the Russian Revolution, Soviet collectivization, and the transition to a market economy. It survives because the Mongolian winter has not changed, and the need it answers has not changed. As long as there are nomadic families on the steppe, there will be Aaruul drying in the summer wind. It was never just dried cheese. It was winter, made survivable, one sun-dried piece at a time. Meat cooked by the heat of river stones passed between hands for warmth, 1,000 dumplings made by a family over 3 days before the new year, fermented mare's milk that sustained an empire across 2 continents, hand-pulled noodles stir-fried with mutton that tasted like home in every country where a Mongolian grandmother found herself, sun-dried curds made in a narrow window of summer heat to last through a winter that showed no mercy. Mongolian cuisine is not simple food for simple people. It is extraordinarily sophisticated food developed under extraordinarily demanding conditions by nomadic ancestors who had no fixed kitchens, no guaranteed supply chains, no imported ingredients, and no margin for error. What they built, the fermentation technologies, the stone cooking techniques, the dairy preservation methods, the noodle traditions, represent some of the most ingenious food culture in human history. The world largely does not know this. Most people have never tasted Korkhog or Airag or Aaruul. Most people do not know that the Mongolian grandmother who makes Booz by the hundreds before Tsuivan is participating in a tradition connected by an unbroken line to the grandmothers who fed the armies of Genghis Khan. That connection exists. It is real. It is sitting in a yurt on the steppe right now, being passed between hands warm from a hot stone. Tell me in the comments, had you encountered Mongolian food before this video? And if you have ever eaten something that made you realize your understanding of a cuisine was entirely wrong, something that stopped you and made you rethink everything you thought you knew, tell me what it was, because that is exactly the feeling this channel is here to chase. Subscribe, because next time we go somewhere else, and the story is just as extraordinary.